Lawful disclaimer and notice of intent. This podcast and all related content are created, owned, operated, and sponsored exclusively by me, the sole author, speaker, and producer. Any other product, service, and/or entity, living or non-living, which may be discussed, displayed, and/or somehow given attention on this podcast is not and has never been an endorsement, advertisement, support, and/or any other kind of validation for its existence in any capacity, nor at all intended to at all facilitate its continued existence in any capacity. I mention things on what I consider to be an as-needed basis to fulfill what I consider adequate as evidence in my best attempt to prove the reality of who I am and what this podcast is attempting to achieve to clearly demonstrate what I consider to thoroughly substantiate my assertions. I act simultaneously in private and public capacities, and this podcast reflects my direct and autonomous expression. It is created and published from within Canada, but is intended for a global audience, including legal jurisdictions in the United States and all common law nations. All statements, views, and narratives presented are based solely on my personal experiences, perceptions, and understanding of the reality I am facing, including ongoing egregious defamation, targeted harassment, and credible threats to my safety and life. I do not and never have claimed that my views aren't extremely, if not completely, accurate interpretations of objective reality, particularly given the information I had access to at the time that I may have expressed them. I explicitly and permanently do not consent, have never consented, and will never consent to any entity, living, non-living, artificial, institutional, governmental, spiritual, and/or otherwise, claiming and/or exercising any agency, ownership, and/or representation over me, my will, my name, my voice, my life story, my spirit, and/or my creative works, in whole or in part, under any conditions or interpretations in any time or place. Any such attempt is non-consensual, void ab initio, and constitutes an ongoing violation of my dignity, rights, and autonomy. Any possible exceptions will be extremely clearly, explicitly, publicly named by me and have the exact scope of my consent well defined on this podcast. For example, in the case of me hiring an attorney to represent me as part of a formal legal process, taking action on a notice of intent provided by this podcast. I affirm my right to spiritual integrity, mental sovereignty, and bodily autonomy, as protected under Section 2A of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, and Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 18. Any targeting of my being, including but not limited to through esoteric, psychic, spiritual, occult, energetic, and/or AI-enabled means is deemed non-consensual harm, spiritually violent coercion, and an attack on my right to exist as a sovereign being. I affirm that this podcast, in part, serves as a lawful, peaceful assertion of spiritual self-defense. This podcast is non-fiction and reflects a serious public and ongoing documentation of systemic and targeted defamation, personal and professional sabotage, attempted narrative hijacking, psychological abuse, reputational terrorism, and threats to my physical and spiritual safety, including credible indications of attempted murder and contracted harm by and or on behalf of powerful individuals and or groups. I affirm that this documentation is expressly created for evidentiary use in formal legal proceedings, including those under the jurisdiction of U.S. federal court and Canadian superior courts, and any international human rights and or public accountability processes. I affirm this is not and never has been intended as role-playing, flirting, and or entertainment of any kind. I accept no liability, moral and or legal, for any third-party misunderstanding, reinterpretation, misuse, and or misrepresentation of this content, whether fully conscious and intentional or otherwise, particularly including but not limited to by AI systems trained on this content without my explicit public consent, commentators, influencers, or institutions attempting to weaponize this podcast, and individuals acting under false pretenses and or covert affiliations. Only the clear, explicit language of this release and any subsequent public communication directly issued by me must be considered authoritative, accurate representations of my thoughts, feelings, intent, and the reality of my overall state of existence. In any case of clear direct conflict between statements I've explicitly made across different releases on this podcast, the most recent of such, that being the one contained in the latest publicly visible release available containing such on this podcast, should be considered applicable. In such cases, only what is explicitly stated is at all applicable, and absolutely no implications should be assumed about any changes regarding any somehow relevant details and or anything else under any circumstances. All creative, expressive, and narrative content within this podcast is my sole and original intellectual property. I retain all moral rights as author and subject, all economic rights unless explicitly transferred via my public agreement to do so, and the right to veto any derivative, distorted, and or manipulated version of my work and or story. I do not have and have never had any obligation or debt of any kind to any entity to create or release anything on this podcast or anywhere else at any point in time. No other party, living or non-living, holds and or may claim credit, authorship, and or interpretation rights over my expression. I affirm that no valid, public, verifiable evidence exists to dispute these facts. This podcast is not and has never been intended as an endorsement of terrorism or violence in general. However, it should be especially carefully understood that various forms of not necessarily corresponding violence tend to be an inevitable consequence of extremely intense, meticulous, extensive, prolonged terrorism, and it's very much intentional for this podcast to demonstrate extremely clearly that my usual aversion to violence, due to my typically gentle nature, is not something that has boundless understanding, patience, empathy, or will persist more or less absolutely unconditionally for any reason. I've always wanted and done my very best to ensure it's extremely clear that at all creating, enabling, and or facilitating the perpetuation of narratives at all in contradiction with my official position that is objectively extremely clearly established on this podcast is not, never has been, and never will be what I've been trying to achieve with this podcast or in general in any of my efforts at any point in time. I do not and never have intentionally incited terrorism, including but not limited to violence, blackmail, and or coercion. I affirm my fundamental intent as peaceful, lawful, and self-defensive. However, targeted campaigns to stalk, defame, threaten, impoverish, silence, spiritually attack, and or physically harm me will be treated as conspiracies to commit grievous harm and or murder. This podcast is an affirmative public notice of my unambiguous non-consent and a lawful response to sustained systemic abuse. While my fundamental intent in communicating in general through any means is not and has never been malicious in nature, I affirm it can, will, and should exert malicious influence upon anything operating with malice towards me and or this podcast, especially more so the more demonstrably I'm proving that malice exists. And it should be understood that any situation where I continue not to extremely clearly receive any compensation or reward I'm willing to accept is effectively, absolutely, unconditionally an increase in the severity of that malice. I've created the entirety of this podcast under extremely harsh circumstances that I've always believed and asserted are entirely unjust for me to be left in, given the reality of who I am. Circumstances of my existence, including but not limited to my current housing status, financial vulnerability, and material limitations, do not and cannot invalidate my legal personhood, expressive rights, and or entitlement to protection under law. I reject any attempt to diminish my credibility and or rights on the basis of poverty, social class, and or housing insecurity in accordance with Section 7 of the Canadian Charter, the Due Process Clause of the U.S. Constitution, and international law prohibiting discrimination on the basis of economic status. Despite the extent I've irrefutably exposed the truth surrounding a conflict that should have been so extremely obviously recognized as extremely serious to the point that my efforts on this podcast should have made a substantial difference in my life long ago, my life circumstances continue to not have meaningfully or clearly improved at all whatsoever. I still have not ever received any compensation or reward of any kind whatsoever for any of my efforts at all involving the conflict being addressed by this podcast, neither directly nor indirectly from any source. I am, always have been, and always will be absolutely unconditionally unwilling to ever at all accept any compensation or reward whatsoever, directly or indirectly, that at all compromises my integrity, whether directly or indirectly. I do not, never have, and never will consent to it being at all considered to be me and or any entity operating at all with my consent and or best interests regarding any communication somehow claiming and or implying that I somehow do ever have and or ever will unofficially support any kind of position at all contradictory with what I've said on this podcast. This disclaimer and notice of intent supersedes any and all contrary interpretations, explicitly including any and all unauthorized claims therein made against me. I reserve all legal, expressive, spiritual, moral, and intellectual rights without limitation. Any attempt to silence, reinterpret, discredit, and or co-opt this documentation must be treated as malicious bad faith conduct and may be cited in formal legal proceedings as evidence of further targeting. And now we see what's really been happening all along, the evidence really being irrefutable. This whole time, Kimmy has been hallucinating that she can just keep pathetically, disingenuously faking to like me while treating me like I'm just trying to be her friend, to betray her, even though she clearly knows I've always obviously wanted to be more than friends and never had malicious intent towards her in the beginning, and it was only after the egregious malice I saw from her that I started wanting and being willing to exert malicious influence upon her existence. It seems she's been doing that malicious backstabbing all along and projecting it onto me as if I've been doing it all along, making me look spiritually dirty and manifesting that into the physical world to leave me in extreme life-threatening deprivation while she builds her dream life without me in it. Obviously, fully consciously and intentionally, entirely to my detriment against my consent. She really thought the truth would never be exposed and she'd be able to get me murdered and cover it all up and pretend I was always the problem. She's just trying to exploit my efforts increasingly egregiously to serve her own selfish goals, to work from home with 2 pets, and probably acting like every bit of affection I've ever shown her is some extremely manipulative, disingenuous garbage intended to impregnate her, to let her have babies that are cats that I've never at all been trying to work towards her achieving having, in exchange for her supporting me pursuing some supposed ulterior motive she's been trying to frame me as trying to achieve secretly all along. She's always known it's entirely to my detriment, against my consent, that she keeps redirecting the progression of consequences resulting from my efforts into a situation where she can extremely selfishly just keep achieving goals I was never trying to achieve, while my time and energy has been drained and has not actually received any real compensation I've ever been trying to work towards, as she egregiously, deviously misrepresents me entirely against my consent, to my detriment, as having been trying to work towards this misery all along. She's intentionally been trying to emotionally dysregulate and provoke me, whether through pettiness or through intentionally flaunting being a heartbreaker and egregiously unapologetically malicious towards me all along. She's been hoping I wouldn't see what's really been happening. I'd be a shallow fraud and go chase other women and or start blindly raging out at her so she can justify how abusive and disrespectful and neglectful she's been to me all along and act like that's what I always actually wanted and or deserved. And the more I simply showed I'm strong-willed and authentic, the more she saw me as stupid, weak, exploitable, and disposable. Unhinged, narcissistic psychopath to the absolute maximum possible extent I could ever fathom existing. And that's not attractive. Not to me. I don't know what the next 20 years means in Kimmy's ASMR family context, whatever that even means exactly. But it doesn't mean anything special to me. I have no idea where that number came from, and absolutely nothing about Kimmy getting any new pets at all ever appeases me, forces me to shut up, changes my position, or offers anyone any real leverage over me, entirely regardless of whether or not she considers them a part of her ASMR family. Neither Snowball nor Juniper are names I've ever considered at all particularly meaningful personally. I had absolutely no part whatsoever in picking out the names of Kimmy's cats, and neither name appeases me, forces me to shut up, changes my position, or offers anyone any real leverage over me. I don't understand at all why she picked them. I'm honestly at the point I don't even really care. I just know I need to unravel all the egregious defamation and violation of my energy that Kimmy's done behind the scenes to build her dream life entirely at my expense against my consent, a life that she so extremely painfully clearly considers ideal, with me being a complete slave to her, completely unpaid for the last 8+ years, and then murdered when it's most convenient, and she feels I no longer have any use in her life, and or I seem like more trouble than I'm worth to keep alive for her. She's basically forced me to have to extremely closely monitor her online activity, especially her Twitch streams. She's increasingly made ASMR over time, because otherwise the egregious false narratives framing me as a pedophile that Kimmy and Jamie have been hiding behind the scenes to bring negative energy into my life from a distance constantly would increasingly aggressively deteriorate my existence. She then has exploited me needing to pay attention to her behavior, trying to exploit me literally to death, to try to fabricate evidence that I secretly really enjoy and benefit from her ASMR in some kind of extremely perverted manner, where it's some kind of exceptionally graceful, lovely act for her to do ASMR for me. Now I believe she's started trying to do soft-spoken ASMR instead of whispers more often, as what I imagine she's trying to frame as some kind of punishment for me not submitting to whatever she wants, basically out of egregiously, unapologetically, malicious, coercive control she's been trying to establish through falsified weights to her ASMR she ever releases anywhere publicly. In doing so, it gives her another avenue to try to weaponize false narratives about anything I ever criticized her for, acting like it's some kind of passive-aggressive or disingenuous retaliation for her not whispering more or not doing other kinds of ASMR things more, when in reality, she's just doing whatever ASMR she actually wants to hear and feels is easiest and most convenient for her, perhaps also to some extent catering to whatever leverage she's given Jamie through a bunch of false narratives so she can try to reinforce to her friends and others that somehow I'm the problem. She's probably been trying to make it seem like it's some heavenly act of grace and love to me when she ever gives any kind of words of affirmation, as if I'm so desperately in need of and so flattered or aroused or whatever, when she indirectly says I'm awesome or deserve everything in the world or whatever. Trying to make it seem like she's giving me everything I could ever want in the world simply by making ASMR and maybe doing whatever she and others have been falsifying leverage over me by treating me as if I supposedly benefit from. All while in reality knowing full well that I get absolutely no benefit from whatsoever. In fact, it's especially aggravating when I know how empty it is for her to say it and how she's just trying to make herself look good and furthering narratives that I'm some hateful scumbag anytime I criticize her, trying to make every bit of anger I ever express seem unhinged and unjustified and indicative of me being a fraud and deserving of even worse ostracizing and humiliating and abusive behavior from her and her friends. Notice how she's wearing very prominent lip gloss already right from the beginning, and then specifically applies especially glossy lip gloss even more on top right after saying chat has good taste. So it seems that Kimmy egregiously exploits applying lip gloss with egregious false narratives, extremely grossly, massively misrepresenting the reality of what that actually indicates to facilitate her egregious defamation of me that attempts to falsify leverage over me to Jamie and enable and facilitate Jamie egregiously exploiting me entirely to my detriment against my consent, while Kimmy's already been doing that all along.
And then they'd both egregiously lie and manipulate others through a falsified triangle of trust between me, Kimmy, and Jamie, where in reality, Kimmy and Jamie were fully consciously and intentionally coordinating efforts, teaming up against me with utmost, absolutely unconditional, unrestrained, malicious intent in order to devour my energy and eventually have me murdered to eliminate the evidence by silencing me so I could never expose the truth. There's probably some extremely heavily political manipulation Kimmy and Jamie have been doing with the relationship between lip gloss and similar things and food because of how I talk about Kimmy's appearance or my general preferences in what my taste is in women. Look, that's just a word I've used. It wasn't some deep double meaning thing having anything to do with food when I've said it. My sexual preferences don't have any direct correlation I've ever been at all trying to display or hint at or anything like that to food. For any reason, I've never at all done anything that should even remotely indicate otherwise to anyone. Taste, preference, inclination, I've used it all the same with no weird hidden meaning when talking about my sexuality. I haven't ever been trying to exploit any particular word choice to hint at hidden double meanings in anything I've ever said. Over time, as I've faced increasing resistance and had to be increasingly considerate to possible political exploitation of what I say, I've had to try phrasing things a little differently and perhaps avoid using certain words as much or in certain phrasing, but I've only navigated around my word choice to avoid misrepresentation, not facilitate perpetuation of alternative narratives to what I've explicitly been saying as it appears when interpreted plainly as it would appear to be conveying meaning. Kimmy's trying to act like I'm an ungrateful subhuman filth if I'm not overjoyed anytime she wears lip gloss or whispers or does whatever various things she's egregiously defaming me by manipulating others that she has some kind of massive leverage over me because of. She's trying to act like she's being kinder to me than I'd ever really deserve, painting herself like an angel, while in reality she's doing the complete opposite of anything I'd actually benefit from her doing, with the reality of all her extremely selfish and literally completely inconsiderate behavior. She knows the only thing I've ever really wanted is the kind of relationship I've been saying I've always wanted, yet she's actively pushing that away as much as possible and then acting like I'm the problem when that upsets me, while trying to set me up to get murdered if I behave in the manner that she's pretending she's supposedly justified in being upset at me because I'm not behaving it. In reality, she's set it up so she feels and seems justified in being upset at me no matter what I do, but tries to make it seem to everyone else like I've actually had some option I chose not to take where I wouldn't have upset her. And the craziest part, I've never had to really care whether or not I upset her. And she definitely knows it by now. She must have known for a long time now already in reality, even if she acts super insecure or whatever behind the scenes. I've genuinely cared about her and wanted a wonderful relationship with her like I've been saying all along, and I've been kind because I genuinely thought she wasn't such irredeemable, unapologetically demonic, absolute subhuman filth, unwilling to ever treat me actually properly. I definitely could have pushed her away and figured out everything I did while putting in work to defend myself and build my image up somehow else if I really wanted to, because that just comes down to work ethic, and I'm clearly not lacking there, or I'd already be dead. Her behavior in reality demonstrates the furthest possible thing from ever having had anything even remotely resembling genuine love, respect, and or trust towards me whatsoever, but she tries to demonize me anytime I call her out for it, even when I provide abundant proof, and she has nothing but her empty manipulative words and extremely fake, shallow, subtle public behavior. I talk about immediately ending a pregnancy by aborting, and Kimmy suddenly gets a new cat? So she's been egregiously exploiting my genuine desire for sexual intimacy with her, and my genuine lack of ever wanting to have children with anyone, and trying to turn my in reality fundamentally fully reasonable and healthy desire to never have kids into some kind of fuel to improve her own life entirely to my detriment against my consent, and egregiously defame me behind the scenes, and then do some extremely petty, subtle, random thing that does absolutely nothing actually good for me, like wearing lip gloss one more time among the many she already has, and then act like she's satisfied the egregious lies about me and all the false narratives she's claiming I was after all along, and then trying to make me look horrible for ever getting angry about the obvious reality she's clearly fully well aware of, that I've never actually been gaining anything I've actually wanted at all out of all of this, and in fact, I've been getting egregiously violated spiritually through some extremely complex perversion of what having children means and what my lack of desire and or willingness to ever tolerate it means. She's been constantly spinning narratives, trying to set some kind of precedent to make it seem like I've been intentionally trying to cooperate with giving her a life she's always been extremely brutally robbing me of my life in order to get for herself, with complete disregard for the negative impact her behavior has on my life. And now every time I speak, her lies are becoming so obvious that she's ordering hitmen to come after me increasingly frequently to try to cover it all up, because she never intended to actually do anything good for me, never wanted to actually have the relationship with me that she should have wanted, that she's been acting like I'm the bad person here for supposedly being fake about wanting all along. After completely depriving any use of my energy I could actually make to actually benefit myself and improve my own life, she pours salt on the wound and tries to shoot me after I'm already bleeding and beaten within an inch of my life, acting like what is actually me caring to survive and overcome her abuse is me being an extremely mean-spirited, fundamentally malicious, bitter hater that was always just trying to ruin her life absolutely unconditionally all along and not doing something nice for myself. When her idea of me doing something nice for myself is letting myself get murdered by the next hitman she sends after me because she's tried to make my life so unbelievably extremely miserable and deprived and not worth living that she makes me want to die because she wants me to believe the world is better off with me just having been used, abused, and eliminated by her instead of ever seeing out my potential to be a positive force in the world in a manner that wasn't completely destroying myself in the process. As if I've always wanted to be like a Jesus dying on the cross for Kimmy's sins, and she tries to punish me when I don't fit that narrative that's most convenient and selfishly beneficial for her and her subhuman filth friends like Jamie and all the subhuman filth from my past who have also all ripped apart my energy with complete disregard for the negative consequence to me to whatever extent they could. Kimmy's even specifically saying things about her audience being smart and talented and capable and whatever, as she's trying to make me feel like the complete opposite of all of those things as unbelievably, extremely brutally as possible. Efforts that already should have made me rich and famous garnered 10 views a video, if that, something that basically couldn't be further from feeling like anything even remotely successful. I'm doing the absolute most I could every day and barely struggling to not get murdered every night, a situation that would have driven most people crazy long ago, as Kimmy tries to make herself seem like she's been supportive to me all along, and I just betrayed so many people, and it's all coming back to haunt me, and that's why I'm mad. In reality, it was Kimmy and others all betraying each other and trying to frame me and then feeding off their extremely disgusting satisfaction seeing me suffering and struggling and considering me vulnerable. Every time everyone hoping that just one more existential assault and I'd just completely lose my mind and end up committing suicide or end up in and out of jail or with some long prison sentence or murdered somehow. Kimmy started by talking about getting a new cat and then proceeds to spend 3 hours apparently struggling massively with saying the word Mediterranean, as if that means something super relevant behind the scenes. Literally blatantly lies that she was pronouncing it worse in the beginning than she originally was, because apparently it's so relevant. Why that word specifically? I have no idea at all. It's one of the most unusual things I've ever seen her do, but the overall reason has been made abundantly clear to me, and I most certainly don't have any even remotely adequate reason to refrain from exposing it. This ends now. Here are some things I suspect clarifying the truth behind will more clearly reveal just how egregiously Kimmy violated me spiritually, entirely to my detriment, against my consent, in order to enable and facilitate her extremely malicious efforts against me. I don't want or need to upgrade Windows 10 to Windows 11. I've never voluntarily installed and or upgraded any operating system on any machine I personally own to use Windows 11, nor have I ever wanted and or needed to for any reason. I've never at all encouraged, forced, or otherwise attempted to influence anyone else to install Windows 11, whether as a fresh install or an upgrade from Windows 10. I have never particularly benefited from anyone upgrading Windows 10 to Windows 11, or even simply using Windows 11 specifically in general under any circumstances. I am not a psychiatrist. I have never been one. I have never wanted to be one. I have never pretended to be one. I have never wanted to pretend to be one. I do not and have never benefited from anyone else somehow impersonating me and or my energy and attempting to act like a psychiatrist in any capacity to any extent. I literally never pick up women, whether on the street or in bars, clubs, malls, or any other location. I've never been looking for pickup advice. I've never given or tried to give pickup advice. I've never tried to take credit for anyone else's pickup advice as if it was my own. I do not and never have claimed to be an expert at initiating and or maintaining romantic and or sexual connections with people. I have nothing to do with Logan Paul and or CryptoZoo in general. I have never scammed anyone using crypto, nor ever at all knowingly and or consensually been a part of any crypto-related scams, entirely regardless of whether or not they include any kind of video game in their schemes. I haven't ever wanted or tried to be a part of any such things either. I'm not at all concerned I'm going insane. While I'm aware there are certain things that can be indicative of mental instability, several of those things can also occur simply under moments of intense emotional distress, especially, for example, when dealing with egregious and prolonged narcissistic abuse that attempts to completely destroy and literally end your life to destiny swap or simply build a life extremely selfishly for the narcissist, where they always secretly were trying to use you like a slave and then murder you to cover up how horrible they really always were to you. I can see why someone might think I'm losing my mind, because when I think of my past life experiences, I see it as two separate timelines. I'm putting together everything I remember, and I've noticed that there actually isn't any fully coherent timeline where I've both ever actually signed a contract with Dixon and went through the insane experiences I did in my short time escaping hitmen while living with John. Reversing the memories I can see from the timelines, I either died to a hitman at some point during the time I was living with John, or while trying to leave, or I died before ever even being able to sign a contract with Dixon, or shortly after. It's strange, but I guess that's what happens when I'm an entity from a different dimension. I'm hearing something about who I thought was my biological father isn't, or might not be. I guess in some universe I'm the result of incest between Mary and John, and in another I'm the result of simply a fake love between Mary and Dixon. Who I am actually, though, I'm neither. I'm literally not from this universe. If I came from a universe where my actual father was either Dixon or John, I really don't know who it was. I also couldn't care less. I don't like either of them, and don't want either of them back in my life ever for any reason under any circumstances. And if anyone ever somehow determines that my actual biological father is someone else, I don't particularly care to ever find out or meet them either. And I also still don't like and won't ever tolerate Mary coming back into my life either way either. I have no interest in debating about Soylent Green or it being made of actual human body part remains processed somehow to be edible. I've never been trying to debate Putin and or any other world leader regarding what's contained within Soylent Green. I do not and have never benefited at all from the existence of Soylent Green. I'm also not aware of any particular detriment to my life as a result of its existence either, but for some reason, an energy of debating Putin about what it's made of was in my energy, although I've never had any interest in that. I'm not currently looking for temporary employment. I've never at all engaged in any communication with Kimmy, any of her associates, any other prominent public figure, or any of my biological relatives at all for the purpose of looking for temporary employment of any kind for any reason, whether directly and or indirectly. Nobody has ever had any even remotely adequate reason to believe otherwise either. The only person I've ever actually gotten temporary employment from was a guy named Ray. I did programming for him as a project lead for a website front and back end for his small business for a little while. That was several years ago. Neither of us owes each other anything, and I don't feel compelled to give his company free advertising. He wasn't bad to me. He actually liked my work and wanted me to keep working for him, but I just felt like working a regular job was draining my soul and extremely negatively impacting my mental state because of all the extreme traumas I'd experienced prior in my life and was still dealing with that had absolutely nothing to do with him, so I quit after a while. And to make sure I'm being clear, I'm not particularly looking for permanent or long-term employment either. I'm not concerning myself with employment in general. Before I do anything else, my first priority is I absolutely destroy Kimmy's life and make sure she ends up committing suicide or getting murdered for her being such incomprehensibly demonic, subhuman filth that's actively trying to get me murdered for genuinely being a good person after she's unbelievably, egregiously, relentlessly abused me and tried to enslave me to build her own ideal life and then murder me to cover it all up and never actually compensate me at all for everything I've done. After that, well, probably while I'm doing that, I completely fix the legal nightmare all the exploitation I've had to suffer has thrown me in with the corrupt Canadian government that all the subhuman filth from my past has exploited me through, and I get probably several of them thrown in prison or murdered for their own egregious criminal behaviors towards me that effectively enabled and facilitated Kimmy to ever even attempt what she did. Then, if it even captures my interest instead of just burning the entire world down, I might care to try to figure out how I'll get some money or something. Definitely not a regular job though, that's for sure, no matter what happens. I don't want or have any willingness to tolerate someone new entering my life for any kind of romantic and or sexual relationship or even just friendship. Absolutely nobody has any even remotely adequate reason to believe otherwise either, and they never really have. I keep saying this. If I cannot have the kind of connection I've always wanted with Kimmy, I will completely destroy her life no matter what it costs me, and I already know it won't cost me my life. And then I'll remain so extremely disillusioned from all of humanity forever that I will never engage at all romantically and or sexually with anyone else ever under any circumstances for any reason. I also never wanted things to end up with me so unbelievably extremely bitter and sex deprived forever, so I will seek rightful retribution of absolutely devastating and destroying the lives of anyone and everyone at all involved in this unbelievably egregious, entirely non-consensual, absolute brutalization of my existence until they're all dead or in prison for what they've done to me. Call me an incel all you want. Just understand I consider you actively suicidal if you do. I believe I'm worth loving. I've always believed I'm worth loving. I've never actually said or done anything to anyone that should seriously suggest otherwise to them. Any attempts to portray me as otherwise are egregious misrepresentations of reality, most likely often intentionally so, with extreme malice against me for the selfish gain of whoever it is misrepresenting me, which I assert is and always has been happening entirely to my detriment against my consent in every instance without exception. I absolutely consider my pursuit of the kind of connection I've always wanted with Kimmy to actually be the clearest indication of how clearly I recognize my worthiness of being loved, not the complete opposite. It's not at all a reflection of me that Kimmy is an extremely selfish, fake, psychotic, unhinged narcissist. Anyone can take advantage of you if you care about them and try to help them. Ultimately, it wasn't just Kimmy that's at fault. Every person from my past, and even the Canadian and United States governments, are also largely to blame. Kimmy never could have harmed me how she has if literally all of those forces were not as malicious towards me as they were. It's never been and will never be a reflection of my feelings about myself that the outer world around me is a reeking dumpster fire. I can literally be the most angelic, lovely person, and Earth can still be a reeking dumpster fire undeserving of someone as amazing as me. And recognizing that doesn't make me some extremely arrogant, delusional brat, or a criminal or a bad person somehow. The objective reality of the evidence of how I've actually lived my life proves what no amount of defamation of me ever could. I am not and will never be pursuing and or willing to tolerate getting traditionally or legally married to anyone ever under any circumstances for any reason. I see the typical government-oriented marriage as basically a scam to energy siphon off of weak males by exploiting their pathetic lust and poor work ethic and or general awareness of reality. It basically just means you're handing your life to be cucked by a woman if you were born a man, in a manner I'd assert is essentially regardless of how you identify your gender to be. I've never believed my being transgender to somehow make me an exception to that, and I've never actually said or done anything that should at all suggest otherwise. The only thing I've ever said that even might have put that into question before is suggesting I'd be open to marrying Kimmy at some point possibly. But I publicly and unwaveringly affirm I've permanently and irrevocably retracted that sentiment absolutely unconditionally. I do not and have never identified with the name Mike spelled any way. I heard something about 107 missed calls. The number 107 has no particular significance to me, and I'm not aware of any missed calls from anyone actually calling me with any meaningful purpose. If I'm going to even go as far as to admit to having access to a phone number at all, I should divulge that I've only ever gotten calls from numbers I don't recognize, which I literally never pick up or respond to, and if they ever left a voicemail at all, it was pretty much always just 1 to 3 seconds of complete silence. Beyond that, scams and random incoherent garbage I also had absolutely no desire and or willingness to give any time or energy to. I'm quite certain the number of calls I've ignored because I wasn't expecting them and didn't know who they were from, which is literally every case I've ever refused to pick up a call, is far under 107. I saw a rather disturbing energy calling me Mike and saying I had a wife named Chloe who ditched me as she laughed and drove away with her friends Stephanie, Gila, and Lauren? What the hell? This name Lauren popping up now as an apparently good friend to someone with the same name as the criminal that's been trying to ruin my life since high school? And then apparently one of her friends has the same first name as Ethan Klein's wife? And who the hell is Stephanie? And why the hell did the energies say they abandoned me in Colorado of all places? I have never been to Colorado in my entire life, nor do I have any particular desire to ever go there. I do not have a wife. I've never had a wife. I've never actually been married, at least certainly not at all with my knowledge and or consent. If I've ever been married on paper, it was completely criminal and entirely against my consent. I was not the one who ever attended that marriage, nor the one signing and or otherwise processing the papers related to it. Like I've said before, I do not and never have at all consented to fraudulent marriages under my name. I'm hearing someone wants to fight me, a physical fight, but maybe legal or verbal or something. Look, I have no particular desire to physically fight anyone, but I'll murder you in cold blood in front of a government building with multiple government cameras watching without thinking twice if you seriously threaten my life and come at me like you'll murder me. So you're gonna need a gun if you even want to have a chance. In which case, I hope you're ready to catch a first-degree murder charge, because you'll have to shoot me in front of multiple government cameras right outside a government building, probably while the government is watching in real time, after I've been publicly repeatedly mentioning multiple murder attempts on me already. I'd strongly suggest undercover police monitor the government building I frequent, especially at night. I see reason to believe I'm becoming in substantially greater risk of getting physically assaulted randomly, especially at night. I see above average reason to be concerned another murder attempt will be made on me tonight, and I suspect Kimmy's plans to stream tonight probably have something to do with that. I'm hearing someone is stalking me increasingly aggressively and trying to watch me everywhere I go and likely plotting to get physically violent with me. I don't know who. I just know I don't actually deserve it. If you want to fight me legally or verbally, I guarantee you it will be a metaphorical bloodbath, and you will be the one bleeding to death. And you'd best believe me when I say I will try to end you as quickly as possible without any mercy or remorse, in the most absolutely brutal manner possible. I don't know why I saw some weird thing in my energy about ketchup. I've never questioned how ketchup is made. I have no particular fixations with ketchup, whether for eating and or other potential uses. I remember Kristen really didn't like ketchup though, at least as far as what he ever told me. It's probably some kind of manifestation of his egregious violation of my energy, somehow trying to justify attempts at entirely non-consensually consolidating my lack of dislike for ketchup against his dislike of it, in his continued attempts to destiny swap through ongoing spiritual warfare against me that Mary, Dixon, and John are still attempting entirely to my detriment against my consent. I'm hearing someone's faking a pregnancy. I also heard a while back from Lily's energy that Chloe was trying to move towards me to get impregnated. I've never had sex with Chloe in my entire life, and most certainly did not impregnate her. I do not want, and have never wanted, and never will want to impregnate her. I've never at all wanted, needed, intended, and or benefited from anyone at all believing that I've ever impregnated anyone, whether literally or metaphorically or symbolically or somehow else. I'd be perfectly fine if I never saw anyone from my past ever again. In fact, not only would I prefer it, it's specifically what I'm absolutely unconditionally unwilling to ever at all tolerate failing to achieve. I never had any real friends, any decent romantic prospects, any truly satisfying sexual experiences, or any pleasant familial experiences. If Chloe's pregnant right now, I believe she should get an abortion, entirely regardless of who impregnated her, since I believe it happened under egregious false pretenses, putting my life in extreme danger entirely to my detriment against my consent. I saw something weird in my energy about I should expect a call. I didn't get any call, and there's absolutely no good reason for anyone to be trying to treat me like I should be or am expecting a call. Getting the call in Shadow Confederation terms is like if your handler is gonna boss you around. I don't have a handler. Nobody can give me the call. Again, if you want to contact me, I have an official Discord account, TikTok account, Instagram account, Twitter or X account, all listed publicly on my podcast's official YouTube channel. I do check my personal email address inbox as well, although I really would have preferred if my official podcast Gmail access was restored, and I hope that happens soon. Do not attempt to call and or text any phone number you believe is mine or owned by anyone I supposedly know. I can pretty much guarantee you that you are not contacting a phone number I actually have any access to, and I wouldn't really say I know anyone in the world beyond knowing I'm extremely powerful compared to most people.